Are you curious about what yoga looks like off the mat, or keen to hear how yogis all around the world live? This show will let you in on the secret that there's no such thing as a perfect yogi. Welcome to the Plant-Powered Yoga Podcast. Please welcome your host, yoga teacher, coffee lover, vegan, and known as the Plant-Powered Yogi, Jess Ivers. Hello yogis, and welcome to episode number 2 of season 2 of the Plant-Powered Yoga Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's episode is talking about the very first part of the 8 limbs of our yoga practice, which is the yamas. And the very first one on that list is Ahimsa. Now you might be like, what? There's 8 limbs of yoga? I don't even know what that means. There's 8 different limbs, our asana practice being one of them. But then there's 7 others that I guess incorporate what it means to be a yogi, and joining all these limbs together in a way is what helps complete our whole practice. So when someone might speak about yoga being off the mat or ways that you might live a yogi lifestyle, that's where that comes into it. And the very first one on that list of the 8 limbs is the yamas, and the first one is Ahimsa. And Ahimsa translates to non-violence. A yama is a moral discipline or moral restraint or a moral vow. So a yama is more about the way that you might live your life and the way that you might want to observe things and think about ways that you can live in the best way possible without causing harm, destruction, greed to anyone else. And today I'm going to talk about what Ahimsa means, how I use that in my life, and also how that relates to living a vegan lifestyle. So if anyone has read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, you might remember one of the chapters in there goes into what Ahimsa means. And it's when non-violence in speech, thought, and action is established, one's aggressive nature is relinquished, and others abandon hostility in one's presence. And the copy of the Yoga Sutras I have that's been translated by BKS Iyengar, his description or his observations on that is that when the yogi has thoroughly understood the nature of violence, he's established firmly in the practice of non-violence. Peace in words, thoughts, and deeds, whether awake or dreaming, is a sign of goodwill and love towards all. In the vicinity of a yogi, men and animals who are otherwise violent and antipathetic towards each other abandon their hostility and exhibit friendliness and mutual tolerance. And obviously there's a sentence in there about man and animals and the way that we might treat them. And that's a little bit what I want to talk about today. And going to the website ananda.com, the way that they refer to Ahimsa is non-harmfulness, and to not wish harm to any living creature, not even to any lifeless object. Ahimsa is about the intent rather than the action itself. It is an attitude of universal benevolence. And this is why a lot of yogis decide to go down the path of vegetarianism or veganism. And what I find interesting is that a lot of yoga teachers, when they first do a 200-hour training, and if it's potentially an intensive training where they're going away somewhere and they're staying somewhere for a month, they'll eat vegan or they'll eat vegetarian. So it is kind of ingrained in that world already. And, you know, I think about my time doing my teacher training in Ubud, in Bali, and everything around there, you know, the island of the gods, and everything, the food you would find was all vegan, was all vegetarian, all fresh produce, and obviously with the intent of no harm. And I want to talk about that sentence there that says Ahimsa is about the intent rather than the action itself. that's where, to me, ahimsa is really important, because it's not necessarily about what I might physically be doing this very second, but it's about the intent. And that might be thinking horrible thoughts about someone, or it might be doing something to get back at someone. It might be all these other combinations of harmfulness going into the world in thought and potentially action. But it's generally about the thought first. And I guess that's where, for me, the way that this weaves into being vegan is about the thought itself, and about the intent. So not so much about the action. I've never gone out and killed an animal to enjoy on my plate. So that action was never actually there for me. But if I bring it back to the intent of why I wanted to do this, and the intent of what I was eating every day, the intent of potentially the long-term effects on potentially my own health, as well as the long-term effects of animal cruelty, environmental destruction, and a whole bunch of other things, that's where ahimsa, to me, is the intent of non-violence towards animals, towards the planet, and I guess towards myself. However, this is where sometimes the yamas can get quite lost in translation a little bit, because we can speak about it being an act of non-violence to oneself. But if we go back to what a yama is, moral discipline, restraint, and ahimsa meaning your intent rather than your action. I guess the way I see it, that if you are looking at ahimsa as a way of treating yourself with non-violence, awesome stuff, but it's what we project out into the world. And I guess it's that way of everything comes back around. And also, as yogis, we want to be offering peace, and we want to be offering good vibes, and we want to be offering all of this good energy to the world. So rather than that just staying internally, and I want that to go out and help others be happy and free. And I've mentioned it before on this podcast, one of my favorite chants, Loka Samasta Sukino Bhavantu, which means, may all beings be happy and free, and may the thoughts, words, and actions of my own life contribute in some way to that happiness and freedom for all. I think if we all gave ourselves a chance to maybe stop, think about putting someone else first or putting something else first, then that can obviously help contribute to the happiness and that free feeling internally as well. So I guess, again, that's where it comes into veganism, ahimsa, non-violence, all of that, that the choices that I make every day can contribute in some way to, hopefully, the happiness and the freedom for something else, whether that's a person or an animal. And this might fall into different categories for you. For you that might be going vegetarian, or might be considering consuming less products that cause harm to the environment. And that might be by the clothes that you're wearing. As yoga practitioners, we can wear a lot of yucky things that unfortunately contribute to the unhappiness to a lot of people that might be making those garments, or as well to the planet with what they might be using. That might be what kind of yoga mat you buy. That might be the way that you treat people when you go and get brunch out on a Sunday morning after yoga class. There's lots of little ways that ahimsa can be practiced. And I'm super excited to have the guest on next week's episode, Amy, who is a Jivamukti trained yoga teacher. Now, if you haven't heard of Jivamukti yoga, we go into a little bit next week, but essentially it's described as the path to enlightenment through compassion for all beings. So I'm really excited to share that with you next week. But if you're listening to this now and being like, so what can I do to practice ahimsa? Or what can I do to practice non-violence in my everyday life? And that might simply be coming up with a gratitude practice. That might be something you do in the morning or at night. It might be something you write down, or you just take a moment to think about it. It might be sitting at your desk and just taking a breath and acknowledging something good in your life, and maybe thinking about someone else, because it can be really easy to focus on the self. And there is the famous line from the Bhagavad Gita that says, yoga is the journey of the self, through the self, to the self. Now, I love that quote. However, I find it a little bit selfish, because that all comes down to myself, my being, and thinking about me only. And rather than doing that, I want to think about how my journey can potentially help others as well. So maybe after listening to this, you might take a few moments to write down some things that you're grateful for. You might think of some ways that you can act in a non-violent way. I know with coronavirus at the moment, it's hard to do this, but that might be tomorrow taking your keep cup to the coffee shop and not getting a takeaway cup. Or it might be sitting down in the cafe so that you don't have to use a single-use item. That might be deciding to choose the vegetarian option the next time you do go out for breakfast. It might be trying something new. It might be stopping and pausing next time a negative thought comes into your mind about something or someone, and just pausing for that moment and just letting that violent action or that violent intent gently slip away. So until next week, practice kindness, practice acceptance, practice forgiveness. I'd like to acknowledge that this recording took place on the traditional lands of the Tharawal people of the Yuin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging for their continuing connection to the land, water, skies and community around us. Thanks again for listening to the Plant Powered Yoga podcast. For more information, visit plantpoweredyoga.com or visit the show notes below. I'd love it if you could rate, review, or even share this podcast with a friend. Thanks so much for helping create a kinder world, and see you next time.